Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Fallback. At the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels this week, European allies addressed how best to support Ukraine as the war with Russia drags into its fourth year, weighing both financial commitments and strategic security concerns. Now, amidst proposals to use Russian frozen assets and rising tensions over Belgium's legal objections, debate over Europe's role in sustaining Kiev has intensified. Joining us now to analyze the latest is Hugo Dixon, commentator-at-large for Reuters. Good to have you on TVP World. Welcome.
Hello, Sasha. Nice to be with you.
I want to start off with setting the scene here, Pearl. So this list essentially has become this big buzzword. It matters hugely, quite literally. It's NATO connected, prioritized Ukraine requirements list. Just give us your take why this has become so significant, why it matters right now, and those big pledges that were made yesterday.
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually, it is such a big deal. I mean, what we saw yesterday was $4 billion. $4 billion is quite a lot of money, but it's not the big bazooka that we're looking for. The big bazooka that we're looking for is this mobilization of the frozen assets, which is the 210 billion euros, about $250 billion. So you just got to put this in proportion. Also, the other thing to say is that for Pearl to work, you've got to find the money. I mean, beyond the 4 billion, if you're going to turn it into something bigger. And of course, a lot of the money would come from mobilizing those Russian assets. So if you want to scale up Pearl so that it becomes really significant, you need the cash. And the way that you're most obviously going to get that cash is by using those Russian assets. So I think we come back again to the question of the Russian assets, which your Deputy Prime Minister Radek Sikorski said yesterday. He said that the whole war in Ukraine could turn on whether Europe is able to successfully mobilize those assets in what is called a reparations loan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting you mentioned the Deputy Prime Minister Sikorski. I remember that line as well. Now I'm wondering, I mean, it's a strong line indeed, but I'm just wondering how realistic it is, because we've been talking about frozen Russian assets or releasing them in some way, accessing them for quite some time. There always seems to be resistance, particularly from Belgium. We've heard it again the last sort of few days, last 24 hours really. How do you see this play out? Do you see them ever, let's say, stepping back, and we talked about appeasing them with some guarantees, but why Belgium's continued resistance to all this?
It's true to say that the debate over the Russian assets has been going on for some time, but this now is the make or break moment. This is the moment when decisions will be taken. And that's for two reasons. First, because Ukraine is running out of cash. It's facing a cash crunch, and we need to take a decision. The European Union needs to take a decision no later than at the European Council on December 18 or 19. So this is not going to spin on and on. The other thing is that Donald Trump is in negotiations with Vladimir Putin over Ukraine's future. And if Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump do a deal without involving Europe and barely involving even Ukraine, then this will be a capitulation deal which will undermine both Ukraine's security and Europe's security. And one of the key cards, perhaps the only key card that Europe holds, are these Russian assets. And if Europe doesn't use those Russian assets, which are a trump card, Donald Trump will reach over the negotiating table and he will grab that card for himself. As you may remember, in that Trump peace plan of a couple of weeks ago, he wanted to use those Russian assets for his own purposes, and America would have got a cut from them. So this is why we need to come to a conclusion rapidly. This is not going to drag on. Then you say, what about Belgium? Now, Belgium, it does indeed have concerns, and those concerns have been partly addressed by the European Commission in its legal proposal yesterday. Again, that's progress. There is now actually a legal text on the table. But as you also noticed, Belgium is still not on side. But the European Commission has said, well, we don't actually need Belgium on side. This is an emergency, and under the EU's emergency powers, we can actually move forward without unanimity. We don't need every single member state to be on board. So things are going to come to a crunch, and they're going to come to a crunch in the next couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. Interesting also, you mentioned there this meeting of all European Union leaders that's coming up in a couple of weeks at that council meeting in Brussels. This is clearly going to be on the agenda. I'm just wondering also, you touched on procedure there, how things are done. You said we don't need Belgium on side fully in terms of procedure. Might they be the only ones against this? I mean, if we're looking how voting is done, unanimity, if we're looking at qualified majority voting, how would this ultimately be decided, and what could be the challenges there?
Yes, to be clear, I said that the European Commission says that this can be done without unanimity. There are different views about this. Some lawyers say that you require unanimity. There is this emergency clause in the EU treaties that allows for waiving unanimity if there's an emergency that concerns the single market. Now, what the objectors to this maneuver by the European Commission will say is they will say, you're actually smuggling into the security area, because this is about Europe's security, which traditionally is done by unanimity, arguments that come from the single market and from the economic sphere. The European Commission will say that these things are completely bound up together, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has already caused huge damage to the European economy. And if they get their money back, if they can unfreeze these assets and deploy them to rebuild their army, that will cause further damage to the European economy. So that debate will go backwards and forwards, but that if it does go backwards and forwards, it will go backwards and forwards in the law courts, and that will take years, whereas the political decision will be taken in the next few weeks. And the question is really whether many other countries will back Belgium in opposing this plan. And I think it's a little early to say whether they'll do that, and whether Belgium will be able to assemble a blocking minority to oppose it. Mm-hmm. But if it does, then the European Commission and the European Union will have to come up with another plan. And as you may or may not know, as your viewers may know, I'm one of the architects of the original reparations plan, but we have different varieties of reparations loan plans. And there is an alternative which could avoid the particular mechanism that the European Commission is proposing, and that is to take the entire Russian account away from Belgium, not just the cash, which is what the current European Commission plan calls for, but to move the entire Russian account to a new vehicle somewhere else, and then lend the money directly to Ukraine. If that happens, unfreezing the assets isn't such a dangerous thing, because all that Russia would get would be title to a loan to Ukraine, which Ukraine would only have to repay if Russia paid it reparations. So there are fallback plans if the European Commission cannot get its plan over the line on December the 18th. But I have to just stress, there is no time to waste. Mm-hmm. The talks between the United States and Russia in Moscow yesterday did not come to a conclusion. So that gives a little bit of breathing space, but we should not be under any illusion that those talks could make progress Trump could pull the rug from under Ukraine at any moment. It is vital that Europe gets its act together, and the Russian assets are the biggest card it holds.
Right, interesting point. Plans within plans. Just briefly on that as well, the ECB also not on board with this fully. They said they don't want to be a backstop to this. One concern was that's being raised by Belgium is that if these things are tapped into, there's a certain type of market risk. How do you respond to that? Is that fair to say? Is there a risk to this? Which argument holds sway? Just briefly.
The biggest risk to the Eurozone financial markets is if Russia wins the war in Ukraine and then turns its attention to other European countries inside the EU and potentially inside the Eurozone, such as the Baltic countries. That would be an existential risk to the Eurozone. The risks that Belgium is talking about with this reparations loan are tiny by comparison.
All right. And then just one final quick point. I'm conscious of the time. Just one brief statement. I mean, the overtures that the Americans have made, speaking of money transactions to the Russians, looking at the Arctic again, certain types of connections there business-wise. Where do you see that play out? Do you see the administration in America being swayed by that? What do we make of those kind of overtures we're hearing as well?
I think that's very tempting to the White House. And so what Europe needs to do is it needs to act to provide some counterbalancing weight to those in Washington who don't want to sell out on Ukraine and who don't want to sell out on Europe. And that's why the EU needs to get its act together fast. If it continues to dither, there's a huge risk that Trump will sell us all out.
So a huge risk there. We'll see how it plays out. Look, thanks so much for all those insights. Hugo Dixon there, much appreciated. And thank you for watching World Talks. We'll stay right here on TVP World for more. Goodbye.